to an SRCC conference in 2008, and I talked to everyone about REaCH. Here we are 5 years later, and I'm still talking about REaCH. But what I was talking about in 2008 was what we understood was going to happen. We were in that phase where it had just come into force, and we were in the pre-registration phase, where all the chemicals were just being assessed and identified as to what will happen. We have now moved on quite a way. The first chemicals have already been past their registration date, so the dossiers should have been submitted. And now we're having to deal with everything that has come out of REaCH. REaCH is a process, it is a process, and we are the generation that are going to have to deal with it, because at the end of it, in 15 to 20 years, hopefully we'll be in a stable environment where all the chemicals will have been assessed. But in the interim, we're going to have to deal with the changes that are brought about by the evaluation, assessment and restrictions. Registration, evaluation, authorisation and restriction of chemicals, that's what it stands for. And we are now in this probably 20-year programme of assessment of chemicals. That means over 30,000 substances are being assessed. And this slide is always something that's very useful. It allows organisations to identify what sort of organisation they are. Obviously you have chemical manufacturers who take raw materials and create chemicals out of them. And then the people who create from those useful preparations to use. And those preparations might be paints, adhesives, all the chemicals that are used to go into the tanning industry would be classed as preparations. It is those top two groups that have to deal with the registration issues. The downstream users are the people who use those chemicals in order to produce products. And tanners will fall into that group, downstream users. But also, there will probably also be suppliers of articles, because tanned leather, under the REaCH legislation, is considered to be an article. Now, a lot of what applies to you depends on where these processes are being done. If you're doing it within the European Union, you will definitely fall into that category. If the tanning is being done outside the European Union, the importer becomes a supplier of articles. And likewise, if you're buying your chemicals from outside the European Union, an importer of chemicals has the same responsibility as a manufacturer within the European Union. It is only the chemicals and preparations that need to register. But for articles, it is all about putting information in the supply chain. Because the intention of REaCH is to reduce the impact of chemical use on human health and the environment. So, I'm going to concentrate on looking at those requirements for substances and articles, because that will mean finished leather and anything that is then made of that finished leather. The definition of articles in the legislation is this, where form is more important than composition in determining function, which is a very wordy definition. But really what it's saying is, what is it intended to do, rather than what it's made of. And the example I always use is a table. Here we've got a table with metal legs and a wooden top. It could be plastic, it could be glass, but the form is made as a table, and that's what determines its function, rather than what it's made of. But generally, consumer goods will all fall into this category. And just to distinguish those, there are another few examples of preparations that are used in the REaCH area. Again, there are a lot of things that we've had dealings with in order to assess them for REaCH for our customers. So, what do you need to do if you are supplying articles? Now, originally, articles were not included in the proposals that were published before 2006 when the REaCH proposal was published. It was just to do with chemicals. But the chemical industry pointed out that that would perhaps have an unintended consequence of pushing production and processing of chemicals outside Europe into these other areas where there would be less control, and therefore what would eventually the consumers be exposed to would actually be less controlled and safe than they might have been if they took some steps. So eventually the European Union saw that argument and made the changes that were requested by the chemical industry, but it had the impact of drawing in a lot more organisations into having obligations under REaCH. So let's have a look at those obligations. For articles, there are two key obligations. They are ones dealing with substances of very high concern, and there are those which deal with Annex 17, which I'll come on to shortly. And it's the substances of very high concern that probably the biggest challenge to supply. Because this is something that never existed before. Between 2008 and now, 138 chemicals have been placed in a list of substances of very high concern, known as the priority candidate list. And these are priority candidates to go on what is called Annex 14 of REaCH. Now, by placing a chemical on this list, it is not being banned at that moment in time. It is being highlighted to be assessed at a later date. And part of that assessment is to gather information about the extent and availability of its use and presence in a number of products. So, if any of these 138 chemicals are present in the article at more than 0.1% on the total weight of article, and that's important, because if you take into account something like a shoe, and you've got the upper of a shoe, that would be different to assessing, say, just the leather on its own, because obviously in the shoe you have a much more impact to the sole. So again, it's the final weight of the product that has to be taken into account. So if you have more than 0.1%, you have obligations. If in addition you're bringing in more than 1 tonne per annum of that chemical in all your products, so it must be tallied across the complete range of your products, then you are required to notify the European Chemicals Agency, and information must be put into the supply chain about the risks and the safe use of that product. Not always directly to the final consumer, but at least to any commercial customers in your supply chain. If you do have to notify, you have 6 months from the date that those chemicals went onto the list. Now, the latest update of the list was in December 2012. So for the 54 chemicals that were added to the list in December 2012, you have until June to notify if any of those chemicals are present. Now, you're probably thinking, 138 chemicals, I've got to work out whether any of those 138 chemicals are in my product. A lot of those chemicals are nothing to do with our industry. Some of them are associated with the electronics industry, some with the glass processing, some with wood processing. So not all of those chemicals are directly relevant. And consultants and laboratories are also trying to find the best ways of assessing materials efficiently in order to get to a risk assessment of how the potential of these chemicals to be present and therefore requiring obligation. But it is not a ban on these materials. It is not, at this point, I'd say, if it contains it, you can't put it on the market. But you can put it on the market as long as you fulfill the obligations. There is another obligation that goes if you've got more than 0.1% in these chemicals in your product, and that is that to respond to requests from consumers within 45 days about whether or not those chemicals are present. Again, it's not a ban, but you just should be able to provide that information in its simplest form by saying yes, it is, or no, it isn't, and obviously have that as accurate as possible. And this is where I think some organisations do struggle, because 45 days, it's not that long, it's a month and a half. And if they've not got the internal communications working from the customer-facing teams through to the technical teams and the people who are going to go back and respond, then some of them can find difficulty in meeting that 45 days. Some of the largest supermarkets have actually tested the robustness of their response by sending in sort of mystery consumers with these REaCH type of requests. I wrote this at the beginning of this week, before I went to Italy, and 14 chemicals on that list at that point had sunset dates. However, another 8 have been added during this week. So this even, I wrote it at the beginning of the week, it's now out of date. So that should read 22 chemicals have now been assigned sunset dates. What is a sunset date? Well, it means that the use of that chemical within the European Union will be restricted from those dates. And those dates are set 2 to 3 years in the future. 3 phthalates are of particular concern to particularly the footwear industry, because phthalates are used, and when they're going to be used in PVC-coated materials, they are used at quite high levels. So that's why we focus on things like phthalates. They've been banned for use from 2015. However, organisations are allowed to apply for socio-economic exemptions if they can demonstrate a clear benefit to the continued use of that substance. So it is not going to stop their presence in imported products at this stage. That would require another decision to be taken on Annex 17. I'll come on to Annex 17 very shortly. So, I said about laboratories trying to make an efficient assessment of products. And this is the sort of thing, this is really focused on footwear. But again, some of the tests might be important for leathers as well. What we try and do is focus on a risk assessment of those products that are likely to be in the materials that we are assessing. And obviously, the biggest one that we have had to date is the phthalate plasters in anything containing PVC and occasionally in PUs. Another large group of chemicals on the list of 138 are a number of lead, cobalt and chromium compounds. And to do that, we use ICP, which is what's going on in that laboratory shot, inductively coupled plasma spectrometry, for assessing the metal content. Now, it's not going to tell you absolutely whether those substances are there, but if you get a clear answer, it will make an assessment saying, yes, I rule those out definitely. And also, by looking at the combinations of metal concentrations, we can determine whether or not certain chemicals are likely to be there. It's a screening test, but it is an assessment that allows suppliers to talk to their customers in confidence about saying what steps they've taken to ensure REaCH compliance. Obviously, we can do some general analysis looking for potential products, but the 0.1% is a lot higher than a lot of the other restrictions that are present in Annex 17, things like PCP, azo-dyes. So 0.1% is higher than we're normally looking at. So we can do quite a bit of screening tests rather than spending a lot of time analysing down to very low levels. Again, as a laboratory, we want to help our customers by targeting their testing. We recognise that budgets are very tight for everything, and that by focusing on the most important tests is the best way of getting a reasonable approach to understanding what is in your products. But of course, if you know that there are, say, flame retardants applied to a material or waterproofing agents, then we can test specifically for the chemicals on the list that might be fall into that category, unless you have information to say you know what has been used by dialogue with the further up the supply chain. So the SVHC list has grown from 15 in 2009 up to 138 by now. That list will not be completed until 2020. You will also see a lot of lists coming from lobbying groups, and we've had conversations about Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth already. Those are the chemicals that they want to see on the SVHC list. They themselves are not the SVHC list. And that's important to recognise, because when these lists are being circulated and asking for your response, they will probably invoke REaCH and sort of say, what is your approach to these chemicals? But the only one you really need to meet the requirements of is the SVHC list. Take account of what's on there and make your response, but the SVHC list is the one that applies. That's the one that comes from REaCH and comes from the European Chemicals Agency. And if you want to see copies of the list, it is available free. It is freely available on the European Chemicals Agency website. But again, we can always help give further information. The SVHC list is a waiting area. It's a sort of chemical purgatory. And the chemicals will move from there as the evaluations are carried out and decisions are taken about what needs to be done to continue to use those chemicals safely in the future. And so they will move from the SVHC list to authorisation if necessary. And then we'll get to that stable scenario where people know what chemicals are safe and how to use them, and they'll perhaps have restrictions placed on the use of them, and people will understand that and the industry will shift and develop. But until that stage, we just need to keep understanding what our obligations are and how we move forward. The other obligation is Annex 17. Now these are the obligations that, to be honest, people have already been dealing with right through the 1990s, since the first scares were published on things like PCPs, azo dyes. It's basically taken the old marketing and use directives from the European directives and transferred that en masse with all the same requirements into Annex 17 of REaCH. But of course, remember, Elton spoke about this earlier, this is a regulation as opposed to a directive, which means that it doesn't need each member state to enact its own legislation. So once it goes into the Annex 17 of REaCH, or any Annex of REaCH, it is a European regulation and therefore is already law. Annex 14, the list of SVHCs, they are not a complete ban on chemicals and articles, whereas Annex 17 is mandatory. And if the chemicals that are present, listed in Annex 17 are present in your product and your product fits within the scope of the restriction, if you place that on the market, you will then be actually breaking the law. And so therefore you should be able to demonstrate that your products are in compliance. Now not all of them are complete bans. For instance, the azo dye restriction only applies to dyed leathers and textiles that are in prolonged contact with the skin. So that actually only covers a small portion of the products that are being used. Annex 17 will increase as decisions are taken on SVHC chemicals. And this is really what your base of your restricted substances list should be. We spoke earlier about restricted substances lists and the fact that there seems to be proliferation and there's issues of interpretation. What is in this is the legislative requirements, and this is the base level. Anything above this almost becomes a commercial decision as to where you want to place your product in the market, that this is what your legal obligations are. But Annex 17 is changing. As I say, more chemicals are going to be added to this. And the Danish government proposed to the European Chemical Agency, probably about 18 months ago, that there should be all leather goods should be assessed, or there should be limits placed on them for the presence of hexavalent chromium. Now, that is already something that is part of the requirements for leather supply for PPE, personal protective equipment. And so therefore, I'm not a tire, so I'm not going to be able to tell you how to do this, but you all know that most of the leather that is produced does not contain hexavalent chromium. There is a potential risk for it to form, but it is not actually there. Most of the chrome in the leather is present as chrome-free. But because chromium-6 is a skin irritant, a carcinogen, environmental hazard, they want to carry out that assessment and make sure that products on the market can be taken off if that's present. And this would extend beyond what comes under the General Product Safety Directive. This would actually be a specific requirement. But this, I think, is not going to be anything that's new. It's not going to place any additional burdens on the actual production processes. What it might place a burden on is actually having compliance data and actually be able to demonstrate that products are free from chrome-6. Already a lot of German suppliers have been taking, the German government has been taking a zero-tolerance approach, and they've been stopping garments, and we're knowing things like leather jackets that have been denied entry into Germany because they've tested positive for chrome-6. And the detection limit is the one that's present in the test method ISO 17075 of 3 parts per million, i.e. not detected, which is the same as the level that's being produced for PPE. But again, in some ways, this could be an opportunity for those tanneries that know that they're producing quality product, and this may be something that will hopefully identify those products that are less than competently produced and hopefully avoid those products getting to the market where there's the potential for them to cause skin irritation. There is actually currently a restriction in Annex 17 on chromium-6, but it only applies to cement. So what will happen is there will be a new entry on leather goods, and this has been approved by the European Chemicals Agency. It now just requires full ratification by the European Parliament and is expected to enter into force sometime in January 2015. So from the end of next year, all goods placed on the market should be able to demonstrate that they are free from chrome-6. So again, that's probably something that's going to come into REaCH, a new development that will directly affect the whole supply chain for the industry. So, just to sum up, this has been a very quick breeze through of where REaCH has gone in the past few years and the parts that are relevant to a supplier of articles. Obviously, the chemical suppliers in the room, they probably got more obligations in terms of registration and evaluation of those chemicals. I'm not really talking about that at the moment, but they'll probably know what they need to do anyway. But what do you need to do? Well, obviously, if you're buying your chemicals from a European manufacturer or supplier, you can probably assume that those chemicals have been registered and all the dossiers have been produced. But it's always worth asking the question. You hopefully will know what is going into your product, and you can compare the list of SVHCs to make sure that there's nothing in there that's going to cause a problem. Again, even if you've got it present, the only thing is to identify the fact that it's there and it's not currently a ban. And you may if the quantities are high enough, have to notify ECHA. But you do have to demonstrate compliance with Annex 17, so understand what the requirements are on your product, which applies to your product, and be able to demonstrate whether that's by test reports or whether it's from declarations to your supplier. And to do that to the comfort of any regulator who may come knocking. These are just sort of Satra contacts. If you've got any questions about REaCH legislation, the training, and some resources, contact me. But if you want chemical analysis, my colleague Martin Hales will help you out. That was very quick.
Thank you, John.